When the ancient people of Israel gathered around their campfires, they did what all ancient peoples did. They told stories. And these were stories that taught them who they were, who their God was, and who were their neighbors. These stories were remembered and they were passed down, and some of them were even eventually written down and preserved in the Bible. We read one such story this morning from the book of Genesis, the story of two brothers, twins, Jacob and Esau. The Israelites told the story of Jacob because they saw him as their common ancestor. Jacob's actions and heroics and adventures and his mistakes were to them indications of who they were and who they were called to be. Esau, for his part, was claimed to be the ancestor of another people, the Edomites, who lived in a land just southeast of the kingdom of Judah. The Israelites felt a close relationship and a close kinship with the Edomites. Why else picture the founders of the two nations as twin brothers? And the connections between the two peoples were clear. They both spoke similar Semitic languages. They had similar customs and religion. The chief god of the Edomites was called Thoth, a god who is described in very similar terms to Yahweh, who we know as the God of Israel. This has led many to speculate that perhaps Thoth was just another name for Yahweh. The Israelites knew that the Edomites were a proud and strong and noble people, and yet for a long time they also saw them as a subjugated people. The Judahites ruled over the Edomites, and there are many indications in the Bible that the Judahites may have mistreated the Edomites, so much so that the Edomites actually celebrated Judah's destruction at the hand of the Babylonians. Now, I believe that when people do that, when they demean or mistreat or exploit another people group on the basis of race or creed or identity, there is something deep down inside them at a deep level that tells them that this is wrong. And that deep feeling, that deep dis-ease creates a certain desire to justify your attitudes. And so people do that by telling stories. Every racist, for example, has a stock of stories that they can tell you that in their mind proves that all people of a certain race are dirty or devious or lazy or whatever vile thing they happen to believe. Racists need stories like that to justify themselves. And if they lose those stories, if those stories no longer remain valid, their racism is undermined. That's just how powerful stories are. And I believe that the stories of Jacob and Esau, at least for some Israelites, fulfilled that role. These stories convinced the people of Judah that the blasted Edomites deserved every bad thing that happened to them. And all stories, including racist stories, can be seen from another angle. And that made me wonder, well, if in the Genesis story, what we have is what the Israelites told about the Edomites around their campfires, well, what stories did the Edomites tell around theirs? And if you know me, you know that I just love telling a story from another point of view. Exhausted after another long day, the Edomite tribespeople settle around their cook fire. They are a tough people who have never minded hard work. But these days there is plenty of grumbling around the cook fires as they see so little of the fruits of their own labors. They also grumble a bit about the food that they share. It consists mostly of a stew made out of the rations provided to them by their overlords, rations that consist mostly of lentils. The stew is nutritious, and it gives them the strength that they need to continue their work, but the diet is monotonous. And well, honestly, the red lentils are food considered mostly to be fit for slaves. Eating together reminds the people of their noble heritage, but it also reminds them of the sovereignty over their own affairs that they lack. No one really wants to dwell on the grimness of their situation, and so before long voices began to clamor for some diversion. The best storyteller in the tribe is besieged with requests. Tell us a story. Tell us the story of our great ancestor. Tell us the story of Edom, whom the Judahites call Esau. As storytellers are wont to do, the old man demurs. He insists that surely someone else must have a story to tell. But then he gives in, as he always does, and the people fall silent. The story begins. Edom was the firstborn son of Isaac and Rebekah. He was born to be a prince among all people, and yet before his birth his way was troubled by his brother. For there were two children in the womb of Rebekah, and Edom's brother, who was always scrawny and skinny, harassed and harried Edom as he grew. And the contention between the two children became so violent that their mother could barely stand it. She feared that she might die. That was when she went and inquired of the oracle of Kos, whom the Israelites call Yahweh. The oracle answered her, saying, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The faces that shine around the firelight nod at these familiar words of the oracle. The words of this poem have been repeated time and again to explain the enmity between these 2 nations. But the people visibly lean forward to listen to the next words, knowing very well that there are 2 different versions of the poem. The elder shall be stronger than the other one, the storyteller continues, to a general murmured approval. But watch out for that younger one. He'll be a tricky bastard. That line brings a peal of derisive laughter. When the time came for the twins to be born, Rebekah brought them into the world. And the firstborn child was strong, and he had a red complexion, and so Rebekah called him Edom, the red one. He was covered with hair when he left the tomb, another sign that he would be powerful and manly. But the moment of his triumph, the moment of his birth, was marred even then by his brother, who came after him grasping at his heel, and so he was called Jacob the Grasper, and so he remained. Edom grew, and he became a powerful man, a hunter who ranged far and wide. There was no beast that he could not bring down with his spear and his bow, for he was the mightiest of all hunters since Nimrod. His twin brother, the Grasper, well, he would not risk the dangers of the hunt. He remained in the safety of his father's tent. He watched over the flocks and the gardens, while his brother faced down lions and bears, antelope, wild ox and deer, ostrich, crocodile, and hippopotamus. Esau was lord of the wilderland, but Jacob, he ruled over the kitchens. Edom knew not that he had chosen the wrong place to establish his domain. He knew not that there was more power in the kitchen than on the hunting range. Again and again, Edom would bring back his game and hand it over to the servants in the kitchen tent, only then, for some bogus reason, be told that he couldn't eat the food himself. And he was offered instead some small barley cake and a bowl of gruel to fill his growling stomach, except it didn't. Jacob was using his influence to starve his brother half to death, and Edom grew desperate. And then came the day, and I know you have heard of that day. You've heard the story as the Judahites tell it. They say that our ancestor despised his birthright and the honor of his place as firstborn son. They rub their faces in it, tell us that we are deserving only of this red stew that we eat because our ancestors sold everything for the sake of it. But we know the truth. Edom came back from the hunt that day. He was exhausted. He had chased an antelope all day long, and for once it had evaded his spear, and he had brought home nothing. That never happened, but this time it had. Jacob watched his brother approach the camp, empty-handed, and he knew that Esau would be exhausted, discouraged, and famished. He knew that this was his chance. The pottage that Jacob prepared that day was different, unlike anything Edom had seen before, for he had made it with onions and red lentils, lentils that Jacob had cultivated in secret and that his family had never seen before. Honestly, it smelled fabulous and it looked intriguing. And when Edom came into the kitchen tent, Jacob was there alone. Edom rummaged around looking for some bread or cakes or something to eat. But Jacob had taken care that there was nothing of the sort to be found in the kitchen, and that the only food was in that delicious-smelling pot that bubbled over the fire as Jacob stirred it. "My brother," Edom cried, "give me some of that red stuff. It's making my stomach grumble so hard that I fear it must consume me from the inside." "Ah," replied Jacob, "and what will you give me in exchange for my magic stew?" Edom laughed, because he thought that Jacob was his brother. He thought that his brother would respect his place as the eldest. He did not see the glint in his brother's eye. "I'm about to die," he laughed, "and you're asking me what I would give you? What wouldn't I give you? You're about to save my life." Jacob laughed too. And perhaps if Edom had listened to the laugh, he would have heard the sinister undertones in it. "Fine," said Jacob. "How about you give me your right as firstborn?" "Done!" laughed Edom without a care, and he grabbed for a bowl and a ladle. The storyteller cast his eye around that circle of listeners. You all know how the Judahites remind us of this tale, and you know how they hear it. They tell it to us as they throw their jars filled with red lentils at us from their carts. They laugh at us, laugh at how much they say that we love these lentils. They tell us that our Father despised his birthright and sold us all out for the sake of a single bowl of such lentils. But we know better, and we will not forget. For we believe the day will come when Kos will remember the firstborn son of Rebekah. I'm sure you have all heard some story or anecdote about somebody who belongs to a certain race or a certain group. A story that implies something about all people who belong to such a group. Even if that was a true story, or at least if it was a story that had some truth behind it, the problem with that kind of story is the way it makes us look at people in a particular group and how such stories are used to justify the way we treat some people who belong to certain groups as if they were all drunks or cheats or lazy or whatever. You have heard such stories. I know that you have. I wanted to tell you the story of Jacob and Esau in the way that the people of Edom might have told it, because I believe it was a story that was used to justify the way an entire people group were treated unjustly. In the 137th Psalm, the psalmist complains about the people of Edom to God. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations. The Edomites were Judah's closest neighbors, their ethnic kin, and yet they hated the people of Judah enough to cheer the destruction of them by the Babylonians. That kind of animosity does not come from nowhere, and you cannot ignore it. You cannot ignore it today when people are crying out about defunding or destroying or taking down certain systems. And yes, it's not okay to cheer somebody else's destruction. But honestly, the people of Edom must have had some legitimate grievances to cry out some things. I think it's really instructive to consider the stories we tell about other peoples, stories that are often used to justify the way we treat them. So maybe just the next time you hear a story that seems to paint all people of a certain ethnic or social group with one broad brush, ask yourself how the people who lived that story from the other side of it, how do you think they might have heard it? Gracious God, as we are trying in our world today to heal the rifts that are there, that are genuinely there, that separate various people of different races, different backgrounds, different people group, let us give us the grace to pay close attention to the stories we tell in the way that we picture people who belong to certain groups. These images, these stories matter. Help us to think in better ways. Amen.